Hi, I'm Brit Garner.
And I'm Rob Spall.
Welcome to Nature Insight.
Speed dating with the future.
Welcome to the third episode of our third season. If you are new to the IPBES podcast, this is where we take a journey together, exploring just why we should care about the science and policy of biodiversity.
So, Brit, in our last two episodes, we've heard about mushroom treks in the Himalayas and some of the network stakeholders that are strengthening and supporting the work of IPBES. But what's next on our speed dating schedule?
It's been amazing so far, and I'm excited about this episode as well, as we're moving from widening the IPBES tent and the grassroots perspectives of stakeholders. We're going to actually trek together into a completely different and even less familiar environment. Antarctica, the frozen continent. It's equal in size to Europe, but seemingly devoid of life except around the edges. It's a place of extreme cold and apparent emptiness, but by all accounts, it's also one of immense beauty and wonder.
All right, Britt, I'm officially intrigued. This is a podcast about biodiversity science, and it seems like we're going to be talking about a place that's mostly devoid of life?
Right. That is a very good question, Rob. And it's actually central to the interviews we're going to share. But come on now, we do have a strict no spoilers policy here, so I am going to ask that you wait to find out with everyone else.
Fair enough.
So someone who's had the opportunity to take in firsthand the reality and wonders of Antarctica is Professor Mike Christie. Mike, who's from the UK, was one of the co-chairs of the IPBES Values Assessment that launched last year in 2022. Yes, Rob, you may or may not be familiar.
Vaguely familiar.
Mike recently embarked on a 3-week-long expedition to Antarctica.
Woohoo! This is what we came for!
He was also joined by Karen Darke, an old friend and colleague who had her own personal and professional reasons for trekking across this frozen landscape.
Should we actually have a proper hug? Well done. By the way, the sea ice just moved. It's now 5 meters away already. 32 meters. It's now over there.
I was able to speak to both Mike and Karen, which was amazing. But I got to talk to Mike first. Thank you so much for joining. I am so excited to get to talk a little bit more about nature's values, the many different values, contributions to people, particularly in places we might not always consider when thinking about the values of nature. You recently went on an expedition or a trip or a journey in Antarctica. Can you tell us a little bit about what the purpose of that journey was?
So the trip was with a friend, Karen Darke. And Karen and I were students together. And when we were at university, Karen had an accident and was left paralyzed. Since then, she's been a Paralympic gold medalist. And Karen's got this thing about the number 79. So she won the 79th medal in the Rio Paralympics. The atomic number of gold is 79, and their PhD was also in gold. And we discovered that the coordinates 7979 is about 79 nautical miles from where most expeditions fly into Antarctica on the Ellsworth Mountains. So our trip was slightly over 79 nautical miles down through the Ellsworth Mountains and then onto sea ice. And what we called the Pole of Possibility was on the north side of Mount Vincent, which is the highest mountain in Antarctica. So you can imagine that our journey was just through these mountains on the sea ice with this backdrop of this amazing mountain range.
What was it like to be in Antarctica? What did your days look like?
It was so awe-inspiringly beautiful. It's very hard to describe how profound it was. The vastness of the place. When you're traveling back from a pole towards the mountains, these mountains were in the landscape, and we traveled days and they never seemed to get bigger. Taking that journey at the speed of skiing, so walking speed through that was amazing. Also in terms of the snow, if you think about the Inuit, they have 50 words for snow. And we saw it in terms of ice crystals sparkling like stars. We saw the strastrugi, which are the ripples in the snow and ice formed by wind blowing. And again, they formed amazing shapes.
It sounds like some of the purpose of this trip was the trip itself, was experiencing this and accomplishing the feat of actually traversing this landscape together. Was there research done as well, or any other observations that you were making from an academic standpoint or even personal standpoint?
We didn't undertake physical research there, but I was chair of the IPBES Values Assessment. And one thing I was interested to explore was, why is Antarctica valuable, and how can we relate the ideas from the way the IPBES, how can we apply their framework to value nature to somewhere like Antarctica? What IPBES suggests is that nature comprises biodiversity, so all the plants and animals and insects, etc. And that biodiversity delivers benefits to people. But where we were in the center of Antarctica, nothing lives there. So why or how can we value Antarctica when there's no biodiversity? But that abiotic aspect of Antarctica, the ice, the snow, and the rocks, they're immensely beautiful. Very few people actually directly benefit or visit Antarctica. So in terms of looking at those values, there are significant, what we call non-use values associated with Antarctica. People watch David Attenborough films on Antarctica and the penguins. People get inspired by the journeys of Scott and Amundsen. So there's a lot of cultural heritage attached to it. So there is an immense value associated with those non-use values, how people measure it or value it from afar. And that is really important.
In terms of non-use values of nature in a place like Antarctica, it sounds like the remoteness itself was actually of great value. Can you speak to that? What did that feel like? How was that valuable to you?
Remoteness was something that we experienced being out there. Where we were, nobody'd ever been there before, but also no plants, no animals, no birds, nothing living had ever been before. And so for about 2/3 of our journey, about 2 weeks, every footstep was the first time anybody or anything had ever been there, but also probably the only time in the future as well. And again, that's quite mind-blowing in how you deal with that in your head. Both Karen and I were just walking through, just in awe of what we're doing and just trying to be in that moment, appreciating everything. I've been fortunate to go to remote mountain areas, to quite remote islands, and everywhere else in the world there are signs of humans. Where in Antarctica there's no buildings, there's no litter, you are completely isolated, and that is just amazing. And the idea of the silence of Antarctica, so if the wind's not blowing, it is just so silent.
Genuine Antarctic atmos.
And it's almost deafening in the silence. And you can hear the crunch of your skis on the ice, but when you stop, it's just like nothing there. So all that is just so mind-blowing, and you feel so appreciative of having that opportunity to learn it. We no internet, no telephone signals. We had a satellite phone for emergencies, but there was none of that daily interruptions you get with technology just now. And again, just removing yourself was really important.
In terms of the kind of almost pioneering aspect, this idea of first. So every one of those ski movements is something where, at least to our knowledge and modern human history, is somewhere that a human has not been. What does that feel like, or what's that impact? How do you sit with that now, looking back on the trip?
We had our pole at coordinate 7979, and we had the GPS. As we approached it, we're following our GPS signal.
You have the distance left to the pole?
Yeah.
And the red line is showing where it's at. which right now it's completely off because the GPS works when it's moving.
Okay.
So right now it doesn't know which way it is.
And we end up going round and round in circles, circling into that point. And I think one thing it reflected was we've got all this technology to find that pole, where if you think about Amazon and Scott, Amazon found the pole, and then a few days later, Scott found the same point with very rudimentary navigation. That, to me, is quite fascinating. We also, when we were preparing the trip, we had all the satellite images of where the crevasses were. We were able to plan exactly where our journey was. We had a very good idea of what was coming, where, again, with the early explorers, they had no idea of what was out there. Yes, we had an expedition, but you had to reflect what it must have been like over 100 years ago for those first pioneers. I think as a time gone by that humans will never recapture, but you can still get a glimpse of it doing little expeditions. And again, it doesn't have to be in Antarctica. We can still reproduce it, but not to the same extent.
With values, you mentioned non-use values and how special those things were to see in person while in Antarctica. I think there's also probably future use values, or at least consequential values, thinking of what this continent and this piece of the Earth means in the future. And many people associate Antarctica with temperature change and global warming and climate changes that are coming. What did you see in terms of that, if anything?
Where we were is in the heart of Antarctica, so there was no real obvious signs of climate change. You just saw snow and ice. Antarctica has about 120 gigatons of ice is lost every year, and that's equivalent to about 50 million Olympic-sized swimming pools. So bits of the ice shelf break off and melt. And over the last 20 years, that's been equivalent to about 1.5 centimeter of sea level rise. If all the ice in Antarctica melted, that would lead to a 70 meter increase in sea level. So if you think about all the cities around the coast, they'd all be gone. But I won't alarm you, that's not going to happen, or certainly not in the short to medium term. And if you look at the impacts of climate change across the world and also in Antarctica, the temperature has risen by about 0.8 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial era. If you look at the Arctic and the North Pole, temperatures have risen between 2 and 3 degrees, so it's been much faster warming. What is probably more of a concern is the Greenland ice shelf. So that constitutes about 8% of the Earth's fresh water, and that will lead to maybe up to a meter of sea level rise over the next 100 years. And around the world, the small islands are really in danger of being inundated with water. Countries like Bangladesh, about 2/3 of that country could be inundated by seawater. And all parts of the world will be affected by sea level rise. So it's really important we deal with climate change and don't have those consequences.
To summarize, thinking about Antarctica and nature and the values, the many values of nature, how would you describe or sum up what nature means in a place like Antarctica?
Antarctica is quite unique in that it is untouched wilderness. The biodiversity around the edge of it is quite amazing, and it's very diverse in terms of the quantity of the numbers of marine species and penguins, etc. There is the Antarctic Treaty, which comes up for renewal in the short while. And at the moment, that Antarctic Treaty says that countries aren't allowed mining for oils and different resources there. I think the other aspect of it is in Antarctica, in the central Antarctica, it's all abiotic. There's no plants or animals. And that does get us to think about what we mean by the value of nature. We can see that it provides inspiration. People love the beauty, the history of it. And that's all really important ways of valuing it in a kind of non-use sense. It's still really important to protect it for its intrinsic value.
Well, I think what's so fascinating and awesome about the wider IPBES community is that we have stakeholders and collaborators who would argue that the water itself is alive. Maybe the ice itself is alive within these ways of knowledge and thinking. And so I'm sure depending on who you asked, someone might see a place like the middle of Antarctica and see, quote, life, unquote, all around them. So perhaps there was some widening of thinking while being with all of what we would call abiotic factors.
Certainly, the ice isn't static. So you've got the wind blowing, so snow blowing. The different temperatures affect the ice. So if it's really cold, you get ice crystals that then shine. If it's sunny or overcast, that affects it. It's quite dynamic. And on the return journey, we followed the same footsteps back. In some places, there's no traces of our footsteps, where in other places, they were maybe still there. And I imagine now there will be absolutely no trace that we were ever there. So it's like clean slate for the next person who might want to come along.
It's its own kind of life and living form, it sounds like. It's exceptional.
Yeah.
It's been amazing to listen to Mike's story because those vivid pictures he's painting of this incredible adventure contrast so strongly with some of the other images that I have of Mike in conference rooms and research venues, working so hard for the last 4 years on that IPBES values assessment. And this incredible bridge between those two realities is this idea of valuing nature beyond just its use for us and for other people, and the importance of considering all the different ways that nature can and should be valued. As someone who works so often with students, Brit, do you have any chance to bring this idea home to your students in the classroom or outside the classroom?
Yeah, I think one of the best sort of non-use values conversations that happens, especially with younger humans and students and kids that are getting into thinking about life on Earth, is just the fact that they can have these favorite animals or these species that they love, and they will never see them. They literally might never see them. It might live a continent away, or they've just seen pictures and videos, and yet the love of the thing can be so strong.
Yeah.
You know I love my sharks, and I thought while living in Montana that I would miss out on having a bunch of shark nerds, these kids. But I'm telling you, I worked with so many different students in, formal and informal ways that live in the middle of Montana, landlocked, and yet have such this huge love for marine life and sharks. And so even being totally distant, it's just knowing that these things exist and that we share this world together is itself super powerful. And that is really, really neat.
I find it amazing that we're able to overcome some of these barriers to experiencing nature in some ways virtually, but there are so many different ways of overcoming barriers. And I think the stories that we're being told and telling on this episode of the podcast really speak to that.
Oh, 100%. And the next person we'll hear from, Karen Darke, can really speak to this. As we heard from Mike, this trip with Karen was also deeply personal. Before going to Antarctica, it sounds like you had several other big expeditions, hand cycling across some of the Himalayas, climbing some of the world's biggest rock walls. What makes you pursue these types of adventures? What about these experiences calls to you?
Well, we haven't got a psychotherapist with us, so fundamentally, the thing that I always come back to is it's this calling to be in nature in all its shapes and forms, and I just love any way that I can access the natural world. And when you have a disability like mine and you can't easily get away from the man-made world, the impact is enormous of just that full immersion in a beautiful, beautiful natural place far away from tarmac and concrete.
What did that look like in a place like Antarctica, somewhere so harsh in terms of environment?
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe that?
Going to Antarctica, I had a special hand-pedaled mountain bike and also an arm-propelled sit ski. And so for the first time in 30 years, I had a piece of equipment that could take me onto a wild beach and to pedal through, just that very shallow part of the ocean on the hard sand. And I remember having this really profound, deep emotional connection to how much I'd missed that, and shedding a few tears on Scottish beaches as I did that, training for Antarctica, realizing that maybe all of the Paralympic years that I'd spent training and racing in a way were compensation for much simpler things that I couldn't do, like walk on a beach with a friend. The ability to do that again gave me a little bit of insight into how it was going to feel to be in nature in Antarctica. I don't think anything could have fully prepared me because clearly it's vast. The size of it is incredible. The pristine purity of it is, well, there's nothing to compare to. It's just so enormous, so white, so devoid of life. People think of Antarctica and think of biodiversity and they think of penguins and all the sea life, but actually where we went was the interior of Antarctica, where there's nothing living apart from maybe a few lichen and a very occasional human being. So yeah, to be in a place like that just stretches for thousands of kilometers with literally nothing, with that knowledge that nobody has been here, really connects you with that part inside of yourself and enabled, I think, all of us just to drop into this very spacious, peaceful place inside.
It's sort of amazing to think that the barriers to access Antarctica were in a way quite similar to the barriers to just accessing, like you said, strolling along the beach. And it sounds like you had a lot of time to reflect while in Antarctica. What were some of those reflections?
I think one of the biggest things for me that I really felt was that impact that we have on the planet. So where else in the world can you go where any tiny, tiny speck of your existence is immediately obvious because it's like this blank white canvas? So any droplet of urine that you leave on the snow, any tiny fiber of a bit of clothing, you see it. Any tiny shred of plastic that's broken off something, you see it. And we did our very, very best to leave no trace. But what it did really make me think about was how many traces we're leaving all the time in the world that we live in normally, which is a bit more colourful. I think it made me think a lot more about reducing my impact as much as possible. The other aspect of being there in that big wilderness was there was something quite luxurious for me about not getting any messages or WhatsApp messages or emails, just putting on that I'm away. I'd already taken this approach in my work, was that the more that we respond to things, the more people respond back to us and the quicker everything gets, it speeds everything up. So how much can we just take a few small steps ourselves just to slow the pace down a little for something that's more sustainable? It's okay not to respond to an email today, and it takes the pressure off and it shifts the pace of things dramatically. So I think that was the other thing that it was a big reminder of, is how we can just take back some space.
And this idea that our speed and busyness impacts the speed and busyness of others. I love thinking about it ecologically in terms of a system. To slow the pace or the energetics in one way, you necessarily impact the other. In terms of the wider IPBES community, we discuss a lot about the values, the multiple values of nature for people. For you, what would you say are some of those values of nature that come through for you?
So many.
Good answer.
I mean, for me personally, nature has had a very profound moment when I was first paralysed. I'd been stuck in a hospital for at least a couple of months. I'd not seen fresh air or been outside. My neck was broken as well as my back, so I had bolts in my skull and a metal halo around my skull with weights hung from it to keep my spine in traction. So I'd been laid literally flat out on my back looking at ceiling tiles for a few months. And it was a beautiful day, and I asked the hospital staff if they might possibly be able to wheel my bed outside. They took me outside, and I was so astounded to be outdoors in fresh air beneath a tree. I remember looking up at the leaves of this tree just utterly in awe, and I didn't want to be brought back indoors again. I actually stayed out until it was well into darkness and the stars were out before I was finally brought back in. I think that summarises a lot. There's a lot of research in environmental psychology around how even a view of nature can accelerate healing. So there's plenty of actual hardcore evidence around it. But for me personally, I've never measured anything apart from just knowing that the sight of something beautiful, the sight of greenery, of the natural world, it's like it resets something inside us, doesn't it?
Completely agree. It has been an absolute pleasure to get to speak to you and hear some of your reflections. I can't thank you enough for giving us your time.
Thanks, Brit.
Brit, I know we often talk about how fantastic some of the interviews we get to do on this season have been, but that one really, for me, was quite something. It's so clear when you hear Karen talking that for her, the connection that she makes with nature is really almost spiritual in some ways, and really the importance of how that makes her feel. It's so hard for many of us, I think, to imagine some of the trials that she's been through, but I think we can all connect to that sense of wonder, that sense of awe that she feels about the natural world. And I think it's also something you hear a bit from Mike when he talks.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, he says that the purpose of their trip to Antarctica wasn't, for instance, directly scientific, but even so, it contained great value for science and for research. And I think maybe that's something we need to talk more about when we explore the concepts of science and of nature and of biodiversity, which is how we can take value from all of these different parts of the work that we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, both of their perspectives, I think, share exactly that. And also hearing about that value, particularly how it can be spiritual and healing in ways, it really asks the question, how do you let everyone access that?
Yeah.
I'm an ocean kid, and I think about the beach and getting out into the water and the fact that wheels are not great on sand. Literally, the simple act of walking along sand and jumping in the water, splashing around as, tide comes in, becomes almost a Herculean feat if you are, say, in a wheelchair or have other mobility issues.
And at the same time, this idea of immersing ourselves in nature, but while we're doing that, while we're connecting to nature, starting to really think about the impacts that we have on the natural world when we're doing that, and perhaps trying to reduce the traces that we leave or the impacts that we have.
Right, while also being realistic that when we use words like pristine or untouched, it's not actually true. We've impacted the atmosphere. We've touched in some way, indirectly even, every piece of Earth. So even in a place where perhaps humans have not stepped before, there's still the signature of the Anthropocene, of this human period of time by the air itself, the molecular composition that has changed.
Mm-hmm.
And so thinking about preserving places with reduced impact, it's not just the direct impact. It's not just making sure you take everything out with you. It's also literally the ways that we're impacting things like the atmosphere, the air, the water, that's all actually connected.
And that came through really well also in what Karen was saying about how internally for her, she tries to slow down, she tries to become less reactive constantly in order to try and slow the pace and, in her words, become more sustainable. And I thought while she was talking about that and your response to her, it really does mirror some of those interactions within ecosystems, between species, within species.
Totally.
This idea that everything we do, whether we realize it or not, does have an impact and in some ways leaves a trace.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, by existing, we impact each other, and that's beautiful, and it's also humbling, and it's also scary sometimes. That's life. That's existing.
Yeah.
Pros and cons always.
I hope we're making more of a pro than a con when we're sort of impacting people when we're talking about this on the podcast. And I think one of the things I'm hoping we're doing is helping people access and explore some of the parts of the work that we're doing that they don't perhaps always think about. This idea of creating awareness, perhaps creating and mobilizing awareness about nature, biodiversity, and the science of that.
That's it for this episode of Nature Insight, Speed Dating with the Future. I'm Brit Garner.
And I'm Rob Spall. Next week, we're going to be doing a bit of turnabout here on Nature Insight. I'm going to be covering the media, and of course normally it's the media we want covering us or the work that we're doing on biodiversity science at least. But I'm going to dive into some of the challenges that are faced when reporting about biodiversity in both the global north and the global south. So go ahead, make a date, and join us again next week on the IPBES podcast for more nature insights.
And in the meantime, you can learn more about IPBES's work on www.ipbes.net or on any of their social media channels. Just search for @IPBES, that's @IPBES. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week.